You've heard of the Challenger disaster, the Waco siege, and maybe even the Great Dying, but did you know how disturbing these events really were? The Branch Davidians were a splinter group of the Seventh-day Adventists who began stockpiling weapons at their ranch in Waco, Texas. This was all under their leader/self-proclaimed Messiah, David Koresh. Before long, this brought the group to the attention of federal law enforcement. The ATF believed the Branch Davidians to have an arsenal of over 100 firearms, 200,000 rounds of ammunition, and a number of grenades and launchers, an alarming stash even in gun-loving Texas.
His explanation is that we were going to be attacked.
Not to defend him, but he wasn't wrong. In early 1993, an initial raid to arrest Koresh and execute a search warrant led to an exchange of shots that killed 4 federal agents and 6 compound residents. Federal forces then descended on Waco to lay siege to the Davidian settlement and force out Koresh and his acolytes. Some of Koresh's followers were allowed to leave, but the rest remained defiant. After the ATF failed to smoke them out with floodlights, power cuts, and other attempts at psychological warfare, U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno gave the order to storm the compound. ATF agents began firing tear gas, prompting the Davidians to begin shooting each other and setting fires to avoid being taken alive. More than 70 people died in Koresh's last stand, among them 25 children. Reno and the ATF were heavily criticized as a result, and the entire fiasco provoked further anti-government extremism in the United States. A cold snap hit Florida in late January 1986, icing over much of the state. The unusual cold altered a rubber O-ring on the Space Shuttle Challenger, which ultimately led to a leak in a fuel tank. This caused a cascade failure and subsequent explosion 73 seconds after takeoff, destroying Challenger and claiming the lives of the 7 crew members on board. The shuttle's launch had been heavily publicized due to the presence of Krista McAuliffe, a teacher who was picked to train as an astronaut as part of an educational outreach program.
I still can't believe that I'm going to actually be going into that shuttle. It just really doesn't seem possible.
After a successful launch, McAuliffe was to tour the country teaching American school children about space and NASA. That's something that's almost lost or forgotten today. Because of McAuliffe, the sheer number of school children that watch the disaster live is remarkable. They're called flashback or flashbulb memories, and there's a lot of people around today that know exactly where they were when the Challenger disaster happened. McAuliffe wasn't the only civilian aboard, though. Gregory B. Jarvis, a Hughes Aircraft Corporation researcher, also joined her and the 5 NASA crew members. The NASA complement comprised Commander Francis R. Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, and mission specialists Judith A. Resnick, Ronald E. McNair, and Ellison S. Onizuka. One minor blessing for the doomed crew was the fact that they likely lost consciousness very shortly after the disaster began, with death from asphyxia sparing them the fiery plunge into the Atlantic Ocean. At least that's the hope. There's another theory that's a lot darker. You can guess how that one goes. An inquiry blamed NASA in part for an overambitious flight schedule in which the agency tried to do too much with limited resources. When President Juan Perón of Argentina died on July 1, 1974, he left his country's government to his wife. No, not that one. Eva Perón had been dead for over 20 years. His third wife, Isabel, took the reins of power. Problem was, she was largely unpopular and lacked political instincts. Isabel was utterly defeated by the political violence and runaway inflation she faced during her time in office, and in 1976 she was overthrown by a military junta led by Argentine military officer Jorge Videla. At first, much of Argentina was willing to put up with the new dictatorship's heavy-handed methods in order to restore stability to the nation. As time went by, though, more and more people came to know someone who had been detained and tortured by the government, or even someone who had simply disappeared, taken by military forces and never returned. Some of these captives had been executed in empty fields. Others were flown out over the sea and dropped from planes. In a particularly sinister touch, the dictatorship stole babies from the politically undesirable and placed them with childless couples connected to the government.
They stole our identities. And an identity isn't just your name. It's also knowing your origins.
All told, 10,000 to 30,000 Argentines were killed by their own government during the so-called Dirty War. In an attempt to settle the public's growing indignation at this repression, the Argentine government invaded the British-held Falkland Islands in 1982. It's probably an understatement to say the UK didn't react all that well to this, and the ensuing Falklands War saw the British military roundly defeat the Argentinians. The junta was subsequently discredited and defeated in a 1983 election that restored democracy to Argentina. Before 1984, the Indian city of Bhopal might have been best known for its historic sites, including palaces, forts, and an artificial lake dating to the 11th century. But on December 3, 1984, the city became known as the site of the worst industrial accident in history. A leak at a poorly maintained pesticide plant run by American multinational Union Carbide released 45 tons of the toxic gas methyl isocyanate over the city. The heavy volatile gas blanketed Bhopal, causing burns and irritation to the lungs, eyes, and skin of those exposed, and sparking panic among the population. Amnesty International notes that more than 7,000 people died from the initial exposure, with a minimum of 15,000 more succumbing to after effects over time. Parade 2004 reports 100,000 people suffered disabling injuries. Even these numbers are likely underestimations, as more than 600,000 people have filed claims by the time of the reports, which was published 20 years after the incident. Shockingly, Union Carbide cut a deal not with the survivors, but with the Indian government, ultimately paying the equivalent of a few $100s per claim to victims and survivors. The corporation blamed an unnamed saboteur for the leak, arguing that this limited their liability. Meanwhile, the plant continued to leak poison to such an extent that a court order was issued in 2004 providing Bhopal residents with fresh water, as the groundwater was still considered to be contaminated.
We all got sick, and it has not improved since then. We are always sick with something.
The siege of Leningrad was one of the pivotal moments of Nazi Germany's war against the Soviet Union, and one of the most important battles of World War II. Leningrad itself was not only one of the Soviet Union's biggest cities, but also a crucial port, and its loss would have meant that the Soviets could no longer access the Baltic Sea. The siege lasted from September 1941 to January 1944, a staggering 872 days of terror, starvation, ruin, and cannibalism. By late 1941, Leningrad and its 200,000 Red Army defenders had become almost totally encircled by German and Finnish forces. Occasional supplies came across Lake Ladoga by barge, and by these same routes, the old, the young, the sick, and the injured were evacuated. Aside from that narrow and dangerous escape route, however, the Soviets had nowhere to go. Leningrad's arms factories kept working, even as German guns intermittently barraged the city, and the Soviet secret police enforced harsh measures against any suspected traitors or deserters. In total, 800,000 people died of cold and hunger, and that's not counting those killed by the battle itself. The siege of Leningrad was finally broken in January 1944 when the Red Army launched a successful offensive against the Germans. By then, the city's original population of 2.5 million had dwindled to a meager 600,000. One of those survivors was composer Dmitri Shostakovich, whose Symphony No. 7 was performed in Leningrad during the siege and broadcast around the city in an act of defiance against the Nazis. When he took control of mainland China after the Chinese Civil War, Mao Zedong believed that the country was in dire need of industrial modernization, so he turned to the Soviet Union for a model. It cannot be said whether Mao did not know or did not care that forced collectivization had starved 6 to 8 million Soviets. Taking cues from the Soviets' crushing of an uprising in Hungary, Mao began to stifle dissent by identifying alleged right-wing saboteurs in the summer of 1957. By the beginning of the Great Leap Forward plan in 1958, no one was willing to point out the recklessness of it. Mao's attempt at a quick and dirty industrial revolution lost China 10% of its forest coverage and produced mostly low-grade iron made from melted-down consumer products. Unrealistic quotas driven by ideological fervor rather than an understanding of farming meant that rural areas were forced to provide more food to cities than they could afford to part with. Those suspected of holding back food for their own families were often beaten or tortured. By the summer of 1960, a famine had emerged in parts of rural China, with people dying in colossal numbers. The scale of the disaster and the secretive nature of the Chinese state mean that the true figures are hard to gauge, but Western estimates range from 23 to 55 million dead. The official Chinese line blamed the weather for the famine, as well as the Soviets themselves were calling in Chinese loans. Even today, Chinese accounts seldom point the finger at Mao and his government. On August 21, 1986, disaster struck a rural area of the West African nation of Cameroon. Lake Nyos, once a still blue lake, released an enormous cloud of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The only warning signs had been a rumbling sound and a sudden spray jetting out of the lake. Carbon dioxide is a heavy gas, and so it rolled out along the adjacent lowlands, displacing the oxygen in the air. When the clouds cleared, 1,700 or so people had died, along with many of the animals kept by local farmers.
I was asleep with my children. I heard an explosion but didn't make much of it. When I woke up the next morning, I discovered some of my children were dead.
Some survivors had been left unconscious for up to 36 hours, and many of them woke to find themselves with skin lesions akin to chemical burns. The Lake Nyos disaster's only real precedent had been a similar event at nearby Lake Manoon 2 years earlier, but that incident killed, and I'm using this word lightly, only about 37 people. Some local people believe the lake was home to malicious spirits, which may suggest why previous incidents escaped scientific recording. The ultimate explanation for the Lake Nyos event was that carbon dioxide had been bubbling into the lake from an adjacent geological vent, but was kept under the water by its weight. When something upset the balance, the gas erupted. Lake Nyos has since been equipped with structures to release future gas buildup at a safe rate. Today, there's more concern for Lake Kivu, which borders Rwanda and Congo and may also be at risk of a similar eruption. Kivuat, a Rwandan company, is currently trying to defuse the problem by extracting trapped methane from the gas layer and burning it for power. When the United Kingdom left India, it left in a hurry. By the late 1940s, Hindu-Muslim tensions had already begun to claim lives, and so Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy of India, arrived on the subcontinent with instructions to get Britain out under the best circumstances he could manage. In practice, this meant he had less than a month to draw borders for Hindu-majority and Muslim-majority states, a process complicated by the fact that there was no way to make Muslim-majority areas contiguous. The result was a total disaster, and the consequences of Mountbatten's utter failure are felt even today. The large and populous regions of Punjab and Bengal were carelessly cut in two. The Sikhs found themselves on both sides of the new border, and many villages argued among themselves whether they had been left in India or Pakistan. Some of those involved decided to try to solve these problems by inflicting horrific violence on their neighbors, and millions of people bolted across the border to whichever country they believed to be safer. Some 15 million people were displaced by the partition, while 2 million were killed in the immediate aftermath. In the years since, India and Pakistan have been at war 4 times, 3 times over the divided mountain province of Kashmir, and once when India intervened in the Bangladeshi War of Independence. Worse still, India and Pakistan are now both nuclear states, raising the stakes of the rivalry to the highest level possible.
Well, it's a very serious situation we are in. We still are. It isn't over.
The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920 is probably the most infamous epidemic to have coincided with World War I, but it was neither the first nor the creepiest. That honor belongs to Encephalitis lethargica, a mysterious illness that spread intermittently from the winter of 1916 to 1928. The disease's origins are difficult to discern due to the chaos of war, but it seems to have begun in Romania. It reached Vienna in 1917 and from there spread across Europe. By 1919, it had arrived in North America and Asia. Encephalitis lethargica had one bizarre hallmark symptom: sleepiness. The disease clearly affected the brain or nerves, but symptoms could vary wildly. Some people became sleepy and then died a few days later. Others became manic, and others simply felt ill and tired for a period before apparently recovering. But even the survivors were not always safe. Some years after the initial illness, a patient could develop Parkinson's-like tremors, involuntary movements, speech difficulty, and psychiatric problems. In certain cases, these after effects presented over a decade after first falling ill. Nobody ever discovered a causative agent for the illness. A true death toll was never established either, mostly because the symptoms were so variable that the disease could have been overdiagnosed as often as it was missed. It's not even clear whether it could be transmitted from person to person. Neurologist Oliver Sacks wrote about his work with the disease in his 1973 book Awakenings, in which survivors with serious after effects were treated with drugs that temporarily helped them improve. If this sounds vaguely familiar to you, it's probably because the Robin Williams-Robert De Niro film Awakenings is based on the book and study. This work introduced the bizarre story of Encephalitis lethargica to a new generation, but Sacks and his colleagues nevertheless failed to fully explain the enigmatic disease. In recent years, you may have been led to believe that we're in some of the most destructive times for hurricanes. That would actually be a big old nope. One of the worst ever was Camille, which in August 1969 hit the Mississippi coastline so hard it destroyed every wind gauge it encountered, leaving scientists to estimate its winds at 200 miles per hour. Tides in the Gulf reached 24 feet, and inland flooding led to devastating mudslides in the Appalachians. Camille's impact was worsened by the fragmented media markets of the Gulf Coast. Back then, Biloxi was the biggest city on Mississippi's coast, but some residents preferred to tune into stations in nearby New Orleans. Panicked Biloxi newscasters gave emotional warnings and issued evacuation advice, while New Orleans newscasters announced the coming of a hurricane but failed to emphasize its severity. Local optimism that the storm would turn toward Alabama or Florida further dampened evacuation efforts. So when Camille howled ashore just before midnight on August 17th, many people were woefully unprepared.
It was unbelievable.
I saw an entire house float within just a few feet of me.
Some 150 people died on the Gulf Coast as a result of the hurricane, 21 of them in a single obliterated apartment building. Meanwhile, in Virginia, flooding and landslides killed more than 100 people, marking one of the worst natural disasters to ever strike the Old Dominion. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British took control of the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, forcing a number of dissatisfied Dutch colonists to flee inland. They eventually created two statelets known as the Boer Republics. Boer is the Dutch word for farmer, by the way. By 1880, the British had become concerned that the Boer Republics could threaten their control of the Cape. It didn't help that they were sitting on a load of gold and diamond mines that the British very much wanted. Britain's first attempt to consume the Boer Republics failed, but they tried again in 1899, and this time they were ready to fight hard. The Boers were up for a fight too, though, laying siege to several towns and beating the British in a number of early battles. Their fortunes were reversed in the first half of 1900, however. The Boer sieges of Ladysmith and Mafeking were broken, and by early June, the capitals of both Boer republics had been taken. All that was left for the British was to mop up about 20,000 die-hard Boers, an effort that took 2 years of brutal fighting and savage scorched earth tactics. The British General Lord Kitchener decided to burn as much of the Boer territory as he could to prevent the enemy from being provisioned. Women and children rendered homeless by these attacks were forced into concentration camps, as were black civilians who the British wanted to work as mine laborers. In total, inadequate food and poor conditions in these camps led to an estimated 50,000 or more civilian deaths. In late 2019, a measles outbreak tore through several Pacific Island nations. Tonga, Fiji, and American Samoa all reported cases, but the worst hit was independent Samoa. Samoa was especially vulnerable to the disease due to low vaccination rates in the country, which had been targeted by anti-vaccine activists. The anti-vaxxers' efforts had been aided by a bizarre case of medical recklessness. In some cases, nurses had mixed the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine they were supposed to administer not with water, but with an expired muscle relaxant. The error had killed 2 children. Measles would go on to kill far more Samoan children than those nurses, however. A Lancet report on mitigation measures claims 81 deaths, most of them children under 4 years old. Notably, Samoa is a country of only about 200,000 people, a population only slightly larger than that of Little Rock, Arkansas. The BBC reports that 8% of the under 15 population died in Samoa.
It's very hard to lose a child.
Once the scale of the outbreak became clear, Samoan authorities closed schools, mandated vaccinations, and forbade gatherings of children, bringing the outbreak under control and finally limiting it to around 6,000 infections. But the survivors may not have the all clear. This is because measles targets particular immune cells, eradicating the body's knowledge of how to fight previous germs it has encountered. As such, those who survive measles have to rebuild their immune memory from scratch, and they may easily succumb to other illnesses in the process. By 1898, the once vast Spanish Empire had been reduced to a handful of islands, which Spain was nevertheless determined to keep. American horror at imperial oppression in Cuba, a boat that went boom, and a dash of good old-fashioned expansionism soon led the US and Spain to go to war. This conflict eventually led Spain to grant independence to Cuba and hand over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Generally speaking, the people of the Philippines weren't exactly thrilled about trading rule from Madrid for rule from Washington. Yet the Filipino revolutionary Emilio Aguinaldo nevertheless hoped that the US might protect his country rather than gobble it up. Alas, Uncle Sam was hungry, and so US President William McKinley sent 70,000 soldiers to pull the islands into his country's orbit. A savage guerrilla war followed as American forces worked to sap Philippine resistance by burning villages and torturing captives. Approximately 20,000 Filipino soldiers died in the conflict, a total dwarfed by the 200,000 estimated civilian deaths. In total, American forces lost about 4,000. The Philippines remained under American control until they were occupied by the Japanese during World War II, ultimately gaining their independence in 1946, on July 4th of all days. Phytophthora infestans is a truly efficient plant pathogen. It's both contagious and lethal. It affects potatoes and tomatoes, rotting and killing them with a disease called late blight, though similar organisms can pose a risk to a much wider variety of crops. Phytophthora infestans can also destroy harvested potatoes, which is why today we know it as the potato famine. The fungus first came to general attention when it appeared in the United States in 1843. By 1845, it was souring fields of potatoes in northern Europe. It had a particularly devastating effect on Ireland, a country that relied heavily on the potato to feed its large population of poor farmers.
Can you imagine that mentality? My God, what I depend on for my existence is rotting in front of my eyes.
Back then, Ireland was part of the British Empire, and the British totally failed to address the burgeoning famine. They sent corn, blamed God, passed the buck to local Irish authorities, and yammered on about laissez-faire economics. Foreign relief efforts made more of a positive impact. Notably, even the people of the Choctaw Nation managed to raise and send $170 to Ireland. Nevertheless, 1 million Irish people died in the potato famine, while nearly 2 million fled the country in search of a better future. Even today, Ireland's population has not yet recovered to the levels recorded in the final census before the famine. The Permian-Triassic extinction is noteworthy for having a human death toll of exactly 0, because we weren't around yet. Had the chips fallen slightly differently, however, this extinction event might have prevented us from emerging in the first place. About 90% of all species on Earth were swept from the board in a devastation that left nothing untouched, dramatically reducing the diversity of life on Earth. They don't call it the Great Dying for nothing.
Oh, this is a big one. You hear that, Elizabeth? I'm coming to join you, honey.
This mass extinction may have taken place over a span of about 100,000 years, which is pretty much peanuts as far as Earth's lifespan is concerned. Possible causes include a meteor impact, megavolcanoes in Siberia, stagnant ocean currents causing a buildup of atmospheric carbon dioxide, or a combination of these factors. One of the few beneficiaries of the extinction seems to have been the wood-eating fungi that gorged on the remains of most of the trees in the world. Other survivors included synapsids, a kind of reptile whose mammalian descendants include human beings. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette may have been the most famous victims of the French Revolution, but they were far from the only ones. The revolution was not so much a single event as it was a sprawl of interconnected riots, battles, power struggles, and reactions, which reached its bloodiest height during the Reign of Terror of late 1793 to mid-1794. In 1793, revolutionary France was at war with most of the rest of Europe, as the continent's monarchs objected to the killing of a fellow king. Panicked by the strength of the alliance they faced and jittery about the prospect of counter-revolution, the new French government cooked up a deliberately vague treason law that could be applied to pretty much anyone. Over 16,000 French citizens were sent to the guillotine as a result, and thousands more were killed in bursts of organized violence. The Vendée, a rural province in France's west, dared to resist conscription enacted by the government. The repression it faced as a result may have killed some 20% of its population. And all this is just the beginning. The European conflict that began with France's overthrow of Louis XVI eventually led to the Napoleonic Wars, which lasted until 1815 and killed some 6 million people. On the morning of November 1st, 1755, an earthquake hit Lisbon, the capital of Portugal. Modern estimates, based on a compilation of witness accounts, place the quake at about a 9 on the Richter scale, lasting for 7 to 9 minutes. To put this in perspective, the 1989 San Francisco earthquake was somewhere around 6.9 on the Richter scale, but a 9 has 1,000 times more energy than that. Yeah, 1,000. An hour later, a tsunami triggered by the shaking hit the city, contributing heavily to the damage and death toll, but failing to extinguish the fires that had broken out across the city. The earthquake was felt in Morocco, Spain, and Algeria. Associated tidal waves hit French Martinique in the Caribbean nearly 3,800 miles away. The scale of the damage means that estimates of the people who died vary widely, ranging from 12,000 to 40,000 of the roughly 200,000 people who lived in Lisbon. Many were killed in churches as they had been celebrating All Saints' Day when the earthquake struck. As many as 12,000 homes may have been lost, along with 46 convents, all 6 of the city's hospitals, and countless treasures in destroyed libraries and collections. Countries across Europe sent supplies to support the city after the disaster. The most significant package came from Portugal's ancient ally, England, which sent cash, food, building supplies, and shoes.